got an interesting debate here. We're going to analyze two Zachs, anti-Zionists and a Zionist Zach, debating on Israel-Palestine. I'm going to be looking at the rhetoric of how they argue, potentially doing some fact-checking depending on what's said, and because of this particular interview format or this particular debate format, I'm kind of curious to see how they might connect a little more person to person. So this reminds me of the debate that I had just recently with Quibbles, Jewish Zionist and Jewish. I don't know if I'd say I'm anti-Zionist. It depends on your definition, but curious to see what it's like for them.
And we're live. What's up, everybody? Thank you all for joining us. We're back with the Zachs.
It's
two
bad.
Zachs, both Jewish. One a Zionist, the other an anti-Zionist. I would say this is probably our fifth time doing this, the three of us. Fifth, yeah. And I'll say we'll give it two more times for you guys to work out your differences, and then we're done here, okay?
That's it.
Okay. Moderator
great to have you
joking.
both back. Whoever's viewing, great to see you all. Before we get started, just a shout out to all our patrons and all our supporters. If you want to support the show, you can find how to do that in the description. This support really helps us take what we're doing to the next level. We're in the process of hiring a few employees to reconcile between people in conflict through respectful dialogue. So that's what we're here to do. Let's get the show on the road. So we are now a month.
So he said dialogue. So this has in big bold letters debate, and then the title. We'll find out whether it's a debate or a conversation or an argument.
Almost a month since the attacks on October 7th. How did we get here? How did we get to this point? Zach Foster, we'll start with you.
How did we get to October 7th? I think for me, the story starts first in 1948, then in 1967, then in 2007. Those are the three turning points.
Okay, wait. So I don't know which one is the Zionist, the anti-Zionist. If I had to guess, I would say left is anti-Zionist, right is Zionist. Let's see. Let's see if I've got a DAR for this.
The past 75 years, and let me briefly go through each one. In 1948, Zionists and then Israelis expelled 750,000 Palestinians from their homes.
Okay, so I think I was right.
And then shot at anyone who tried to return to their homes in the year and a half after the war. In fact, in 1949, 1950, Israel slaughtered more than 1,000 armless, defenseless Palestinians returning to their home after a war. And I think even to understand how we got to October 7th, you have to understand that 75% of the people living in Gaza as of October 6th were refugees from that war or their descendants. So you're dealing with a population who never believed they lost the right to live in Palestine, the population never lost the belief that they have a right to live in Palestine, even though they were violently ethnically cleansed from it. So I think that's the first thing to say. And so so I think the next major turning point in this
So that was interesting. So his primary argument so far is that most of the people who were involved in October 7th were descendants or people who were expelled from their homes in 47, 48. And then it looked like he was going to go for slightly more incisive kind of corroborating piece of evidence or description, but he went with something just kind of descriptive, like they haven't forgotten, they don't believe that they've lost the right, which is, I think, a pretty neutral description. It's not really an argument, but it's an explanation maybe of what's happening there.
Trying to understand how we got to where we got to today is 1967. Israel occupies Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and other parts in Sinai and Golan Heights. And from 1967 to 1987, Israel is militarily occupying the West Bank and Gaza, and on average kills 32 Palestinians every year for 20 years, kills 630 Palestinians over the course of those 20 years. This is before the rise of Hamas. This is before there are rockets flying into Israel. This is before there are any terrorists in Gaza or the West Bank, by Israel's own admission. And so it's a brutal military occupation.
Yeah, so he sped up. I know this video sped up, but relative to how he was talking before, he sped up a lot. It seems like he's nervous. For me, that makes it feel like the points that he's making aren't really landing. It feels like it became tougher to connect to what he's saying. I think overall what he's saying kind of is accurate, but it's hard to focus on any one thing when he's kind of rushing through it. Feels like I don't know if there's a time limit or if it's just he feels nervous about presenting his argument.
1986, there's an interesting poll that is conducted in which Palestinians are asked, they're asked 1,000 people are polled in '86, and 50% of them report being harassed or physically abused at checkpoints. More than 50%.
Here, let me watch this regular speed so I can give like a more a more accurate analysis of his style.
Of them, 20% have their homes demolished or sealed. 30% are prevented from leaving abroad. Many report being
Right, so he's stumbling between pieces of arguments. It feels a little bit disjointed. It's the feel of, it feels like he's more nervous whether we'll buy into what he's saying. So it's like he's trying to throw a lot out there. When you're making these kinds of arguments, these kind of opening statements, it's important to imagine that what you're saying will connect with your audience, and to say it in a way that's not about feeling like, oh God, am I stupid? Are these bad arguments? Does this make sense? Just thinking about how can I present this as clearly as possible. Whatever arguments you have at that moment, it's going to be what it's going to be unless you're pretty good at improvising. You want to just focus on clarity, just focus on having what you're saying be understood, pausing between each statement that you're presenting, and then thinking about how those link together into some broader picture. So right now he's talking about the way this is framed. He's giving an explanation of the brutality that was seen on October 7th, and he's trying to connect that to the brutality that the people involved in October 7th experienced either themselves or within their family, starting in 47, 48. He's talking about 67. So he's trying to connect those things, but you want to create very even stepping stones for your audience who's viewing to get there.
Political arrests, something like 40-50% report political arrests. So basically, you have this brutal military occupation, which Palestinians are being abused, harassed, killed, arrested, detained. This leads to the outbreak of the First Intifada in 1987, in which there's a spontaneous, uprising.
So right, these are events, but it's better rather than listing a bunch of events that I understand what he's saying, how these relate to his argument, but to make it much more explicit of this kind of activity pushed a people, beyond into a situation where this result is a human understandable thing. That's my guess at this point of what his argument essentially is going to be.
Overwhelmingly nonviolent, especially initially. In the first year, Israel slaughters 142 Palestinians in Gaza. Gazans kill 0 Israelis. That radicalizes organizations that were previously charity organizations like Hamas, who turned to violence. And then, the Palestinians in Gaza increasingly over the 90s turned to violence as a result of Israel's brutal suppression. In fact, you don't even have the first Hamas attack.
So that's like a much more directly stated, as a result of Israel's oppression, they turned to terrorist acts. That's directly connecting the fact and the broader argument.
On civilians until December 1990. Okay, which is in response to a protest in October 1990 in which Israel slaughtered 22 defenseless Palestinians. So that radicalizes.
And so he's saying, and they didn't attack civilians until this date. I don't know if that's accurate, that it wasn't, he said, until 1990 that any Gazans or any Palestinians committed some terrorist act toward Israeli civilians. That's probably not accurate. Maybe he said Hamas specifically. That actually might be accurate. Wait, let me just roll this back. I think he said Hamas.
1990. Brutal suppression. In fact, you don't even have the first Hamas attack on civilians.
First Hamas attack
December
on civilians.
1990.
Okay. Yeah, that's probably accurate. So he's saying that, hey, you shouldn't look at this situation the way it's framed as, wow, October 7th, terrorist acts out of nowhere. What on earth could possibly justify this? You should see it as they've refrained for so long from that same level of brutality or worse being directed at them, and only now have they responded. And that's like, if you zoom out and look at it with that perspective, it's hard to not have some empathy for their position at the very least.
Okay, which is in response to a protest in October 1990 in which Israel slaughtered 22 defenseless Palestinians. So that radicalizes Hamas even further. But even it's not really until 1994 when Hamas really embraces violence. Why? Baruch Goldstein enters the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron and slaughters 29 Palestinian worshippers in a massacre. That radicalizes Hamas even further. And so it's really not.
Right, and then, okay, so this is great. So now he's on one particular line of argumentation. He's strengthening it with specific example after specific example. This is really well organized. So he's saying that, like, this is the event that an Israeli terrorist act did that radicalized Hamas and caused them to become more radicalized and them to resort to violence, which I don't think is ever like a good excuse, but it's definitely a perspective. It's definitely a context.
Not until the late 90s, from 94 to 2000, that Hamas really fully embraces violence. And then I think really to fully understand and appreciate how we got to where we got to today, Hamas obviously takes power in Gaza, and they win the January 26 elections, and democratic elections, free and fair elections, and the international community, although apparently believes in democracy, just doesn't believe in democracy when it doesn't like the result. And so the international community, together with Israel, imposes this land, sea, and air blockade on Gaza. And so for the past 16 years, from 2007, when Hamas took power in Gaza, to the present, Israel has imposed a suffocating blockade and siege that leads to the death of thousands of innocent Palestinians over the course of that 16-year period.
Hello, Fireblood Nice, welcome. It's going pretty well. Yeah, I already feel good about this debate. I feel like this is, at first I was concerned about his opening statement, but no, this seems really well composed. And apparently they've talked a few times before, so it seems like they must have some rapport. They don't hate each other. So it seems like it's probably going to be a pretty good debate, but I haven't heard the other guy yet.
It has also waged 5 wars on the Gaza Strip. In 2008, it killed 1,000 innocent Palestinian civilians. In 2014, it killed 1,500 innocent Palestinian civilians. In 2018, it slaughtered Palestinian defenseless protesters, nonviolent protesters, marching to the wall in the Great March of Return, killed 250 Palestinians during that protest. So, and then in 2020.
So on a content level, I feel like you could have gone into that anecdote with a tiny bit more detail of describing specifically there was like a moment of that march that was especially viewed by the world as horrific. Was the part when there were protesters with signs in front of a wall and who were unarmed, who weren't throwing Molotov cocktails or rocks or anything. Israeli snipers on the wall started shooting people, which was seen as just, barbaric, brutal, in the same kind of way as like different attacks back and forth have been.
Again, it waged another assault on Gaza and killed another 100 Palestinian civilians, 250 Palestinians total. So you've got 5 wars waged on Gaza. You have 16 years of blockade and siege on Gaza, always illegal because it's punishing innocent civilians who took no part in the hostilities, who do not even support Hamas, who were kids at the time Hamas was elected or were unborn at the time that Hamas was elected. So a brutal 16-year military siege, 56 years of occupation.
Oh, and you know what? I really appreciate use of the word siege there, because that's, I think, when you talk about, is this an occupation? Is this apartheid? What is this when it comes to Gaza? I think a siege is like a very it's a very defensible word to use when you're talking about that situation. If against your wishes, some other country prevents you from moving goods in and out of your borders, that's a siege. That's like classic siege. So I think that's a very that's a very difficult to dispute description, which I like when people use language like that in debates. It makes it much stronger. If it's not necessary for it to be an occupation for whatever argument you're making, to follow to some meaningful conclusion, then use a more defensible, less arguable word, so that you can focus whatever parts of the argument you want to push forward on closer to your intent of where you want the argument to change somebody's mind. You don't really necessarily, maybe you do, but in general, people don't want to focus their arguments on, is this an occupation or a blockade or apartheid when it comes to Gaza? That's usually not the thing that most people care about. So if you use a more debatable term, something that somebody else can bring some different definition or different evidence over to kind of combat your description and your framing, then you might get stuck talking about that rather than you want to talk about, okay, this is unacceptable in the same way that October 7th is unacceptable, and this needs to be addressed. That's the argument that you want to be spending time going back and forth on.
And 75 years of displacement as a result of the creation of the refugee problem by Israel in 1948. And I think really to understand October 7th, you need to understand that entire history.
Okay. Yeah. No, he tied it well together there. I don't know if similar opening statements have happened in the previous debates and he's kind of fine-tuned it, or if this is like totally new. Maybe I'll go back and watch these. Yeah, thanks for the chatter who sent this in.
Thank you, anti-Zionist Zach. Zionist Zach, the floor is yours.
Just real quick, I want to thank Adar for having me on again, and for my debate partner and friend, Zach Foster, for being here. If you ask the Palestinians about the start of the conflict and why they're so upset with Zionist Jews, they will tell you. They're very open about it in their explicit statements. They write about it in their charters and Hamas.
Yeah, he's going to say the fact that Jews moved there during the British Mandate before any violence is what he's going to say. Let's see if I'm right.
Hamas's charter. It's written in the PLO.
Or upset that there's a country of Israel at all is maybe what he's going to say.
Charters of 1964 and 1968.
One of those two.
You will find it in online resources like the BDS website, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions.
Which is, just for clarity for people who don't know, I'm not saying this invalidates it, but that's an American, or at the very least a Western movement. This isn't a Palestinian movement.
You will find it in a popular, a very poorly written resource that's I've seen called Decolonize Palestine, and they all give the same
I don't know where that
origin point of the conflict, and that is around 1918, 1920, when the Balfour Declaration is issued and the presence of Jews as a political body is recognized by, at first, the British imperial power, and then ultimately the international community. That is the origin point of the conflict. It is not the blockade of Gaza, because there was Palestinian violence before the blockade of Gaza. It is not 1967 and the occupation, because there was Palestinian violence before that. Nor is it 1948, the Nakba, because, there were the events of Hebron in 1921 and the uprising in 1936 and 1921. The point of origin is when Jews begin to arrive in large number and when they are recognized as being an independent political community.
Okay, I call both of them. Yeah, so the arrival of Jews in British Mandate Palestine and the recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. That's when he says the violence started, or the antagonism started, anyway. Which I think is not inaccurate, but yeah, no, thank you for sending this in. This looks like a fantastic debate. I'm excited.
Palestine. Right? The problem with the Jews in Israel is not the Israeli state, but rather is the presence of a settler colonial community.
It's interesting that he just owns it's a settler colonial community, because that's usually ground people end up, Zionist, anti-Zionist would end up fighting over. That's interesting. He's just so what I would say is his task right now during his opening, from my perspective, is to say why that's, I mean, basically you would have to say that that's like anti-Semitism. That's like that's where you're trying to land that. I think to really deliver this argument, you would have to talk about violence as a result of those, which, let's see. Yeah, let's see if he goes in that direction. But that's what I would want to see for this argument to be carried home, rather than like, okay, the people there didn't really like that, but it was settler colonial. Is it even? You have to show that it's because of anti-Semitism primarily, and then you have to drive that a little further past that. So let's see where he goes with it.
Of Jews, and when you say that somebody is a settler, you are saying that they have an alien, that they are aliens, and that they have no right to belong in that community.
Okay, pretty neutrally stated. I agree with that. Yeah.
Right. It's like the.
So let's see. What is he going to say? So he's either going to talk about how Jews were there a long time ago, or diaspora from there, which normally I would put that a little low, but for some reason I'm getting a vibe that I'm going to put a little higher for this guy. Or you could talk about the Mizrahi Jews that like didn't leave the Middle East, and maybe they were kicked out of other like Arab Middle Eastern, Muslim Middle Eastern countries. So Arab Jews. He's going to talk about one of those two.
Palestinian chant goes, colonizer, go home. This is our home. Our, referring to the ethnic, indigenous Palestinian people.
Again, it's interesting that he's just owning those of these are the indigenous people telling the settler colonials to go home. I'm guessing he's going to say why that's not accurate rather than why that's not okay, because
the land belongs to the Palestinians and the Jews have no part in it. One popular mashal or metaphor that the Palestinians use is that Palestine is their home and the Jews are squatters in their home. So imagine you have a home, you're living in, it's a 2-story home, you go on vacation, you come back, and there's somebody living in the second floor of that home.
It's barely a metaphor, but yeah.
You get very upset at them, you say this is not fair, and they say, okay, let's do this. I'll have the second floor of the home, you'll have the first floor of the home.
I'm going to be honest, I'm going to be a little bit biased toward this guy because metaphors that don't even need to be metaphors really irritate me in these kinds of debates. Like, just talk about the thing. You're saying, metaphorically speaking, Palestinians believe that Palestine is their home. You don't need a metaphor for that. Just go direct. Pet peeve.
And we'll split the home. You say, no, that's not fair. This is my home. And they say, okay, I understand that's a problem. You want to go upstairs. So let's do it like this. Let's both live in the home and we'll share the home. And they'll say, no, that's not fair either. This is not your home. You are squatters in the land. You are Europeans. There's no such thing as the Jewish people. The land belongs to the...
It feels like he's describing this in a way that would really appeal to conservatives. Like, try telling a conservative person, like, hey, somebody is squatting in your home and you're not allowed to evict them and you have to share your home with them. That's Israel for the Palestinians. I'm curious to see what his, like, target demographic, like, audience would be.
Palestinians, and to the Palestinians it must return. When we talk about the return of the refugees, there's a lot of very confusing Palestinian phrases that need to be contextualized.
So I was probably going to say people aren't refugees if they're like descendants of people who weren't born there.
Return of the refugees does not refer to the return of the refugees to the land of Palestine. Rather, it refers to the return of Palestine to the refugees and to the people. So that is the fundamental issue here.
Okay, that's an important point to make for his argument, whether it's about being able to return to your home or your home being able to return to a state. I think he's saying without Jews. That's his argument at this point. Okay. He's on stronger footing now.
That the Palestinian people have never accepted the presence of Jews in any arrangement. Not in 2 states, not in 1 state. Jews are settler colonials, Jews do not belong, and Jews have to leave. I have one last point, and then I'll turn it back over.
Okay, let's see what this last point is, because so far he hasn't. I don't feel that he's made a compelling argument. I can say why. Let me wait to hear what he says for his last point.
The operative phrase that we kept hearing from Zach over and over again was in response to, right? Hamas's violence is in response to.
Okay.
Palestinian violence is in response to, right? Now, if I were to ask Zach, do you support Hamas's terrorism on October 7th? He would say no. And I know he doesn't support it. He doesn't support it. He doesn't justify it, but he explains it. Palestinian violence to the left always needs an explanation, not a justification, though a recent poll said that 51% of 18 to 24-year-olds fully justify Hamas's.
So it's interesting. I don't know. It seems like most of his argument is focused more on the actions and sentiments of American Jewry or the American left, rather than on Palestinians themselves. I wonder if that's going to be a consistent orientation.
Assault. Putting that to the side. Palestinian violence always needs an explanation. There must be something that caused it. There must be some sort of act of oppression that came before. Palestinians only strike when they are struck. And intellectuals like Peter Beinart will put it this way. He'll say, well...
Ooh, that felt like a retreat in that moment. He was about to explain something, and then he pauses, and then he says, this intellectual said it this way. You be the intellectual. So tell us why you think that means that.
You know, all people are violent when they're oppressed. And you say, okay, well then, how come Israelis act violently?
Yeah, I mean, what he's saying so far just doesn't logically follow as an issue. X leads to Y. Y can occur without X. That's just not the logical relationship that's been set up between these variables. So far, that's not a contradiction. Let's see if he can bring that to a contradiction.
And they don't really have an answer to this question. You know, again, if all people...
I mean, so the answer that people usually would say something like, well, settler colonial violence is like, it's inherent in settler colonialism. Violence is inherent. It's about taking people's homes away. They wanted that land. They didn't want to share it or whatever. They took it with force. They're violent settler colonialists. This is like the history of, I don't know, capitalism or imperialism or whatever, right? So that's what people would say. And then he would say, well, wait, can't there be an explanation? He just hasn't put these two statements in contradiction yet.
Choose violence when they're oppressed. Well, then who acted violently to the Israelis?
Yeah, so what he's saying just doesn't logically follow, unfortunately. There's like a missing logical link to try to connect these things. Yeah.
And so basically what the left has done is they have split the human race into two groups. There are the pure, holy...
So what he's getting at is that this is anti-Semitism, that we're judging one people one way and another people in another way, and he could say that same thing in a more relatable way by saying, you know, we've got an in-group and an out-group, and the people in our in-group, we explain away their actions. In the out-group, we say, oh, they must be evil people. You people on the left who are making these arguments seem to be in the in-group with Palestinians, and so you explain away their violence, but for Israelis, they're an out-group, so you see that as a character flaw in them. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. It's kind of a meta argument because it's saying like, why do people have these perspectives in the argument rather than really talking about the content of the argument themselves. Question from the chat: why is it going on about young people on the left and the West Not sure how this is relevant to the argument other than just a standard talking point. Yes, that's what I was saying, that it seems like his perspective is really directed at people in the West, maybe Jews in the West or people on the left in the West, who have this perspective toward the Israeli-Palestine issue. So he's actually just kind of moved away from talking at all about the conflict itself, any history of the conflict. I mean, he talked a little earlier about history of the conflict, but he moved away from that, and he's really just talking about perspectives on the left of people. I tend to not like that form of argumentation. It feels like it's putting the cart before the horse. Maybe they've already talked about on previous arguments more of the content of that, so I might be missing that. And now this is something that he's moved to over time, where he's now talking about the person who's making the argument rather than the argument themselves. Pandora, hello, welcome.
Indigenous Palestinians, and there are the wicked and impure and vicious and aggressive Jews and white people.
I am Socrates over here, the one of them who isn't paused.
Palestinian violence is reactive. There's always something that comes before. Palestinians are naturally peaceful. If you look at some of the Palestinian mythology, the writing about the history of Palestine before the Zionists got there, you'll see that there's very little written.
Yes, I am Socratic in my philosophy and my philosophical practices and my discourse.
And there's very little written because history is the record of violent acts between people. It is the record of oppression.
Do I believe in postmodernism? Yeah, there's definitely postmodernists. Yeah, Trump, Jordan Peterson. Like, do you mean, do I subscribe to postmodernism? I don't know. Give me a definition of postmodernism, and I'll tell you whether I subscribe to it. Onion Helmet, welcome. It's good. I'm excited about this debate. This guy, Zach Corner on the right, who's the Zionist side, I feel like he's a little bit wandered off the mark here. Am I a postmodernist in my philosophy? What's your definition of postmodernism? Tell me what that is, and I could try to answer.
Of battle, of conflict. Before the Zionists arrived, there was no conflict. Palestinians and Jews and Muslims and Christians coexisted perfectly.
Right, so this is kind of just, I guess you would say, like an argument from incredulity. Oh, you mean to tell us that these indigenous people were so peaceful, and then the evil Westerners arrived? It's kind of, if an argument doesn't work, if you don't say it in a silly voice, it's not a strong argument. This feels like it feels whiny, to be honest, is the way this comes across. Oh, you get to explain it with these. So this is truly like argumentative versus debating. So Foster made a kind of debate style argument of this, X leads to Y leads to Z. And Zach is kind of saying, well, somehow you get to go to Z, but we have to go to G. Like, that's, I don't know, why? Why is that? Postmodernism is a complex philosophy typically associated with the skeptic movement. Generally is critical of the notion of absolute objective truth. I mean, there are objective truths. When you're talking about stuff in the world or a meaning of something, absolute truth, I think you can question that for sure. Well, so, I mean, you could, taking that definition, you could see some postmodern tendencies in what he did. So his Euthyphro dilemma, one of his famous couple of dilemmas, is like, is God just good, and so whatever he tells us to do is good? Or is God good because he knows what is good, he's perceived what is good, and he acts in that way, and therefore we might perceive what is good? So it basically comes down to, if God says X and our reasoning tells us Y, is it possible that we might be right and God might be morally wrong. Is that conceivable? You look at something like, early Jewish, Torah story of Abraham and Isaac, and God tells Abraham to kill his son Isaac, to sacrifice him, and Abraham goes to do it, and then a goat comes out of a bush, and God says, no, sacrifice that instead of your son. But it's like, if Abraham were to do that, would that have been good? That's like a basic question that kind of tears into a notion of not necessarily objective truth, but bestowed truth, or special hidden truth, or some kind of foundation that cannot be questioned. It's kind of tearing away at this this ground floor of philosophy, which is like God, that you couldn't go below, and now we can cross through that that kind of ground that's been dug. So, one perspective. All right, let's get back to the debate.
Until the white settler colonial Jews showed up and paradise was lost. This is the myth, the racial myth, that drives Foster's thinking and the thinking of the rest of the left.
That's a great point that you left off on there, Zach. Unless you wanted to jump in, Adar, I'm happy to respond to some of those points.
Yeah, so now just to summarize, now that I've heard Zach on the right, Zionist Zach, that feels weird to say. It's alliterative, though. So now I can look at Zionist Zach's full argument now that he's stated, his opening statement. I feel like he started off kind of okay. I can't even remember what the first half of his argument was. He went off so far into the weeds where he's talking about why do people have this perspective in the argument rather than the content of it. He tried to create a contradiction between statements that simply was not there, or he did not connect. So the statements of Palestinians historically happens to be the case that the violence they've committed toward Israelis is the result of prior violence toward them by Israelis. So that's one statement. And then the second statement, the actions of the early Israeli settlers were not the result of Palestinian violence toward them. Those simply aren't in contradiction. It could be the case that one group historically has responded to antagonism toward them, and another group could have been antagonistic toward them without antagonism. There could be people who were being raided by the Vikings. Did those people do something bad to the Vikings that warranted the raids? I don't know. They had land and possessions. The Vikings, I think, mostly farmed, but sometimes they raided, and they wanted those possessions or whatever, or to take slaves to sell. Was that because those people did something bad to them? Not necessarily. It's totally possible for people to have asymmetric actions toward each other. That's just part of history. So those things just aren't in contradiction. He didn't say why they should be or why they are. He's just saying this is unfair. They're making excuses for Palestinians, but the Jews are these evil Western colonial imperialists. And it's saying, yeah, that's how we see it. And there's no contradiction. So I feel like he failed to make some kind of compelling, A to B to C argument of why his perspective is the one that others should adopt. Just to go back to chat. Sure, yeah, feel free to link a video. Reading the Socratic dialogues, one has the feeling, what a frightful waste of time. It feels like something that a character in one of his dialogues would say. I think, I mean, they're pretty different. I really like the Symposium. That's the dramatic, fun one. The Apology is it's a very different style. It's really more of a monologue than a dialogue. Let's see what is this. What have you sent me?
This is a video I've been wanting.
Zarathustra's serpent. Oh, interesting. Hmm. Oh, this is talking about their charter change 6 years ago. Yeah. Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah, I can take a look at this sometime. Thanks. All right. So I'm not satisfied with Zionist Zach's opening argument, but let's see if I guess let's see where the conversation lands, because Zach Foster, I feel like he has a linked argument. Let's see if he can get the focus to be on the point of his spear that he wants thrust, or if they get kind of pulled around.
Take it away.
Yeah, so that's great. I'm really glad you brought us back to Ottoman Palestine before Zionism, because that is really my bread and butter, and I love talking about that. On the eve of Zionist immigration, Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived in Palestine in relative peace for many, many decades. And I think zooming out even further, Jews obviously.
So he's directly addressing exactly what Zionist Zach was trying to make the crux of his argument, whether these statements were in contradiction. So anti-Zionist Zach is directly addressing that and saying, like, yeah, it is the case that Jews, Muslims, and Christians in pre-mandate Palestine lived in relative peace for decades. So relative peace for decades, those are both, I think, satisfy the basic kind of challenge from the other statements. And they're, again, I really like, Zach Foster being really, really measured in his language. Lived in relative peace for decades. He's not going for centuries, some broad turf to try to defend of history. He's saying relative peace, so he's not saying, it's perfect. Maybe there were some issues. But, it comes off as a very reasonable argument. It should be relatively easy to defend compared to biting off more. So, again, I like his measured language. Really appreciate that.
Obviously fared better under Muslim rule than they did Christian.
I don't know if either of them are religious. We'll see if it comes up, but I don't know. Rich, I don't know if you know, because you've seen probably more of this.
Rule, and I can't think of a serious historian who would disagree with that point. But let's zoom in back into Ottoman Palestine. So, in Jerusalem in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, right before Zionism has left its mark on Palestine, you had Jews and Muslims living in the same buildings. Their kids were playing in the same courtyards in the old city of Jerusalem. You had Jews and Palestinian Arabs living on the same streets in Manshiyah, which was a suburb of Jaffa. You had Jews celebrating Ramadan together with Muslims. You had Christians and Muslims dressing up on Purim, celebrating Purim with Jews. In places like Sheikh Jarrah, you had Muslims accompanying Jews on picnics to celebrate Jewish holidays together. The same Sheikh Jarrah, where today there's an effort to ethnically cleanse dozens and dozens of Palestinian families from that neighborhood. Okay, so I'm not here.
So he's really, really direct facing the challenge. He's saying, yeah, it was like a lot of goodwill between these groups, like not just relatively peaceful, but actual real connection in each other's lives. And now it's just horrific, right? Really specific with historical facts to bolster his argument. Yeah.
Here to tell you that there were zero problems in Ottoman Palestine. I'm not here to tell you that the Ottoman Empire treated all religions equally. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that things didn't have to turn out the way they did. There was a certain amount of coexistence. There was a certain amount of acceptance across religious boundaries, and I might even go so far as to say that.
Yeah, I am Jewish. I'm not particularly religious, but I mean, yeah, I don't care about those kind of questions of, is it wrong to settle the Holy Land, or is it right, theologically speaking. If I had a really good reason, I would have some means to be able to try to investigate that from a theological manner, but I don't personally care.
By the early 20th century, in many places, especially among the elite, especially among the intellectuals, the fault line was not necessarily Jewish, Muslim, Christian. The fault line may have been whether you were, an Ottomanist, who supported centralization of the empire, or an Ottomans who supported decentralization. And so you had many, for example, the editors of the Palestinian newspaper Philistine in 1911. So we're talking 20 years into the Zionist uh, colonization of Palestine. And by the way, they use the word colonization of Palestine, so I'm just using their language. But you had in 1911, the editors of the Palestinian newspaper Philistine, the Isa cousins, they hired and paid for a Jewish Zionist to write for the newspaper. Okay, out of their shared desire and their shared belief, to try to bring modernity to Palestine. They hired this Jewish writer who was writing all about the Palestinian peasantry and how they need to adopt modern techniques of agriculture, and they need to embrace modern ideas, like democracy, like constitutionalism, like development. So they had this shared vision of an Ottoman future, of Ottoman loyalty, of that we're all in this as Ottomans together.
Yeah, I mean, it's on some level, at like a debate analysis level, it's almost tough to not zone out because how just on the ball Zach Foster is, and it's like the ball is so far out of the court from like a debate perspective. Let's see. I understand why some people are anti-Zionist, but I don't know why some anti-Zionists are fine with dismantling the right for Jews to have a nation state due to Israel's actions, but not say dismantling China's right to exist, which is much more brutal. I mean, I won't say none, but I would say that in general, anti-Zionists aren't against Israel having a state. I'm sure there are. I disavow that perspective. Like Israel is a state, it's recognized, it has a right to exist. Yeah, there's nothing. I don't support or make any argument that says Israel should be dismantled as a state. Period. That's not something that I would support. And so I don't know if you want to look into who's worse when it comes to human rights, China or Israel. I mean, there's different ways to slice that, but I don't think we need to go into that argument to just say I don't think either should be dismantled. So I would make that. Yeah, and I don't want to speculate just why somebody might make that argument. Somebody might say Israel should be dismantled in the same way that the United States of America should be dismantled because it's stolen indigenous lands and it should be land back. That could be one perspective. I don't know, what percent of people feel that way versus there could be some people who are just straight up anti-Semitic, and so they, want Israel to be destroyed. There must be some. I thought that was the definition of anti-Zionism. No, so this is interesting. Every time this conversation comes up, what does it mean to be a Zionist? What do Zionists support? It's always something that comes up as a question because there is no single answer to it in this conversation. Everybody's trying to push Zionism to mean one thing or another based on whether they want to use it in like a derogatory way, saying like, oh, you support genocide, you're a Zionist. Or somebody who's saying like, no, I just want, Israel to exist. Maybe it doesn't even have to exist there. It could be, take part of Florida and make that Israel. I don't know, right? So people truly mean different things for themselves when they're describing other people, when they use the word Zionist. So maybe I need to make a short, literally just saying what are all the uses in conversation, because I've done this before. Let's see. So let's see if I can rattle this off the top of my head real quickly. So Zionist can mean everything from I don't like you and the way you're debating, and I think you're a pro-genocide, Western imperialist, fascist, whatever. Screw you, you're a Zionist, right? Or it can mean, hey, you're a Zionist, you support the state actions of Israel despite how horrible and genocidal they are. Or it could be, again, used kind of derogatorily, you believe that Israel should exist in a way that prevents other people from existing, and that's unreasonable. Or it can mean, so these are kind of calling somebody else a Zionist, and it can mean on this other side, somebody who calls himself a Zionist, somebody who says, I just believe Israel should exist, as a state. It doesn't have to be here. It could be anywhere. And then actually maybe there's two more states. Somebody who says, I'm a Zionist, I believe it should exist here. And somebody else might say, I'm a Zionist, I believe it should be here, and it should be here for religious reasons. And then somebody else might mean it should be here for religious reasons, and it should expand to swallow Jordan. So there's this whole spectrum of what a Zionist could mean in this conversation. People use it in very different ways with very different intents and meanings and contexts and backgrounds. So it's important to understand all of those. Try to understand where somebody's coming from in what they're describing when they use the word Zionist, but don't get too caught up on one single definition. I would say don't waste time arguing about which definition it is. Just to understand all those meanings are out there. Let's see if I can cut that into a little short. What do I mean when I call myself? I haven't used the words anti-Zionist to describe myself, because again, I just don't feel like it's useful to use that language. It's so ambiguous. It's so contested. It's so contentious. I don't think it says anything to anybody other than I'm on this side and you're on that side, which I'm not interested in doing. That's not how I like engaging with anybody on pretty much anything. Income Psychom, welcome. The way I see it, if you're going to use an anti-X term, you need to have a solid definition of what X is. As I understand the typical understanding of Zionism, it's the belief that the Jewish people should have their own state based on the same land generally that the ancient nation of Israel existed on. Right. That's absolutely one of those definitions. Yeah, exactly. To say I'm anti-X, I need that to mean something a little bit consistent. I'm just not going to use that language because it's just far too inconsistent, and it's just argumentative rather than even it wouldn't have a meaning that brings any kind of useful nuance generally. I can't think of a situation when I would say that. I would say, so I'll situate myself within that spectrum in terms of just what is my perspective. I don't have to use anti or pro anything language. I would say that Israel is a recognized state and deserves to exist. It by international law, it should exist, continue to exist. And at the same time, I can recognize that its founding crimes is the term, so to speak, of, in America, we had indigenous people whose land we pushed them out of and we genocided. In Australia, same thing. So many countries have their own indigenous population at some point who's been pushed out. With Israel, this conflict is still ongoing at this moment in history, right? So it's like having an opinion on how indigenous people in America are treated in, the 18th century, right? It's a different thing than kind of when it is happening, and there's like a meaningful level of violent conflict between a settler group and an indigenous group. That's something that distinguishes this moment in history, but not necessarily this nation from other nations. And so the founding crime of genocide and land theft and total war against another people and the bringing of violence to an area is something that is shared by other Western nations. I don't know that I've come to a single conclusion on, should the United States, should Australia be disbanded? I don't think so. Should massive land bag happen? I think, that does seem reasonable. But the reason that that the focus right now is here in Israel is because that genocide hasn't been completed. the way that it has been, the level of the degree of resistance, I guess you could say, the degree of violent, all-out resistance of an indigenous group to a settler group is fundamentally different at this point in history. And also, I would recognize that Israel is illegally occupying land. It's committing war crimes. These are things that could require censor or action from the UN. And I think living in America, we materially and financially and through trade and other ways support the state of Israel. And not only that, consider them like our close ally and close friend. And if we are to have that relationship, they do need to be held absolutely to a better standard, even than other countries. So when people say there's a double standard, why do you have this condemnation of Israel but not Iran? Well, we aren't close friends with Iran, right? So our standards to which we hold them are obviously going to be different. You hold your friends to higher standards than you hold people who aren't your friend, most people. So that's another just part of the equation. That's my kind of overall perspective. Given that definition, I would say that I'm not fully anti-Zionist, but I do heavily disagree with the colonialist, anti-indigenous actions of the current state of Israel against the Palestinian people. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Let's go back to the video. Just for your awareness and understanding, we're 50 minutes in to the stream. We're 17 minutes into the video. I'm just telling you, I'm not finishing this today, in case you were hoping for that. It looks like this is going to be probably a few sessions, but I hope you don't mind. My style is going through and rigorously picking this stuff apart. I think that's probably what you're into anyway, if you're watching me. So,
and again, I think the reason I'm talking about this is because in a framework in which Jews and Muslims and Christians, in which Jews and Muslims all believe in a shared political vision that is an Ottoman state with an Ottoman identity, and Ottoman symbols, and an Ottoman future, Jews and Muslims actually were able to live in peace together. It was only when you had Zionists come and say, we don't want an Ottoman state, we want a Jewish state. We don't want a state that tries to include all of the subjects and all of the religious communities. Instead, we want a state that privileges one community over all the others. And that's what Zionism was. It was, and so that's why every Zionist leader from the 1880s to 1948, they all asked themselves.
Yeah. So again, not saying whether I agree or disagree with his argument, but what he's saying in his argument, the structure of it makes sense and is compelling. So he's describing this relatable scenario of things that we understand happened in history in Rwanda or in Iraq. One group is a minority but is given control basically over the majority. It's violent. When that situation reverses, it's violent. So this is a situation that is unambiguous, that we understand occurs in the world. He's saying the shift from this prior functioning of this area to the way it is now, it's very understandable why that's violent, and you shouldn't look at it as, oh, this particular group is being violent, but like the situation that's been created is itself the root cause of the violence, and that's what should be changed. That's a compelling, to me that argument makes sense. Whether or not I agree with the facts that go into substantiating that, that's a different question. I think I mostly do. But that structure of the argument, I think, is compelling.
Same question. And literally, we're talking about almost every Zionist had an opinion about this question, because they had to, which is, how do you establish a Jewish state in a land that is overwhelmingly non-Jewish? Because they all had to confront that question. Theodor Herzl answered that question in his diary already in the 1890s and said, we're going to have to probably expel them. Ahad Ha'am had to ask himself that question.
And I believe that quote is accurate. I've seen that
question. Israel Zangwill had to ask himself that question. Arthur Rupin, Smolansky, Yosef Weitz, Chaim Weitzman,
Right. So, of course, this doesn't, what he said so far, and I'm not saying he won't go further, but what he said so far doesn't inherently prove that there's an intent to genocide or push people out, but that there was a recognition that something would have to be done about the quote-unquote Palestinian problem, which is there's people living on a land that we want to live on. So it's saying that this antagonism was recognized by the people who were putting themselves into that situation. And so there's no way to say that antagonism wasn't there if the people who were, who are those people involved are saying we recognize this antagonism. You can't say it doesn't exist.
Ben Gurion, Moshe Shertok, they all asked themselves the same question, and most of them came back and most of them replied to that question and answered that question and said, we're probably going to have to expel them. Some believed that maybe they would leave voluntarily. Some believed that because of Zionist ingenuity, that they would happily live in the Zionist paradise because of all the benefits Zionists would bring them. But most of them believed ultimately in transfer, either voluntary or forceful. And I think kind of that is ultimately what you have to understand about really the core, I would say, struggle among Zionist leaders throughout the late 30s and 40s was, if we really want to establish a Jewish state, what are we going to do with the fact that most of the people that are going to be in this Jewish state are Palestinian, and they're not willing to accept a Jewish domination? They have a strong identity, they have a strong national identity, they have strong roots in the country, and so they're not willing to.
Right. So just, again, kind of singing this guy's praises, basically. He's been able to explain the situation in a way that doesn't demonize anybody, makes everybody's intents and desires and incentives and situations clear, and the result clearly follows from that situation. So this is a situation that I wouldn't find compelling if Zach Corner were to argue, or you're just saying Jews are evil. That's very much not what he said, which, again, Zach is actually really doing a really good job addressing what was basically the entire second half of Zach Corner's argument, that, you anti-Zionists are just saying that Jews are evil. Why? Maybe because you're a racist or something, right?
Accept being subject to Jewish domination. And so I think that's really the key to understanding kind of Zionist history, really from the 1880s to 1948. I also want to address one other point, which is this question of kind of, you're talking about, reaction, actions and reactions, like who started it, right? Like,
Oh, interesting. I wonder if he's going to say the result of these Jews' actions were the result of their persecution in their countries of origin that they left from. I'm sure he's going to mention the Holocaust, but I think he's not going to say only the Holocaust. He's going to say persecution more broadly. So if we're even talking about like a blame game and where to put the blame, it's not even on these Jewish settler colonialists. It's the people in their native countries who were violent toward them, that they were pushed toward violence. So it's even more difficult to somehow make the claim that you're saying that Jews are inherently evil or something like that.
I'm talking about how these are always responses to Jewish violence. In 1919, the Palestinians organized a national congress, and they organized 6 or 7 of them throughout the 1920s. And in each of those congresses, they state something to the effect of, we want to establish a democratic state whose representatives would be elected by the Jewish, Muslim, and Christian inhabitants of Palestine before World War I. That is basically the position of the organized Palestinian political community in Palestine in the 1920s. They were pro-democracy. They supported the right for Jews to vote in that state. They did not support the right for Zionist settlers to vote in the state, who had arrived there illegally, in their view, because because the British imposed this mandate on them against their own democratic will. Right? I mean, recall that the only reason Zionism was able to prosper in the first place was owing to British colonial rule in Palestine, which was fundamentally anti-democratic. Right? Palestinians were asked in 1919 by the King Crane Commission, do you support a Zionist program in Palestine? 85% of people said no. But it didn't matter. The British didn't care. And so they imposed British rule on Palestine, and they facilitated Zionist immigration to Palestine and Zionist land purchases in Palestine. And all that was fundamentally...
Just debate structure. I'm curious if these are like timed back and forths, or if he's just talking, he's giving his argument, and if Zach Corner is just waiting to hear him out, or if these are timed. I'm curious actually what the kind of overall structure for this debate is. It's so frustrating how hard it is to have nuance on this topic. If you criticize Israel, taking to be anti-Semitic, if you support non-Israeli Jews, you're accused of supporting genocide. Obviously, these aren't universal, but they feel common enough that it's exhausting. Yeah, absolutely. It's understandable why this topic is contentious. That's not surprising. But I do feel that I feel that the lack of nuance in this topic is counterproductive, um, and when I say the level of nuance, let me be clear that I'm not saying we have to nitpick every single thing before we start trying to stop a genocide. I'm saying that too much of the discourse is on like level 0 or -1. It needs to be on level like 1 or 2. It needs to be on the level of saying things that are concretely and defensively true. It needs to be, I mean, basically I'm saying that, what Zach is doing, I feel that his level of conversation around this is on the very, very high effectiveness side, even though he's being not hyperbolic or not, or let me see how to phrase that more neutrally. He's being very, very measured in what he's saying versus somebody who would maybe be more direct or more extreme. Sorry, Zach Foster. Zach Foster is being extremely measured in his language versus somebody who I would imagine, when I'm imagining like a speaking tone, is more fired up about what they're saying, would be maybe less measured. Not saying they would be necessarily even inaccurate, but just less measured in what they're saying. I think it would be effective to have more Zach Fosters in terms of the style of communication. I think it's easier for people who do not already agree with your position to absorb arguments in this way. And I think that this will get more people onto the side of believing that it is unjust, the violence that Palestinians are currently facing and have faced for a long time, and that the time is now to create a Palestinian state that can live in peace alongside an Israeli state. That's fundamentally the goal. It's not about demonizing anybody or saying that this argument needs to be destroyed or whatever. It's about achieving this goal. And I think personally that more measured, defensible arguments in the way that Zach Foster is making them, I think needs to happen. So I really appreciate the way that he's discoursing on this.
Anti-democratic. And I think that when you begin to realize,
I mean, but to say it another way, I think what he's saying is very, very strong and very compelling.
That the core principle of Zionism is not democracy. In fact, the core principle of Zionism is actually anti-democracy, because at any point from 1920 to 1930 to 1940...
Right, and so this is addressing even, why do I call myself an anti-Zionist? Well, because I'm pro-democracy, and Zionism is against democracy in this particular way.
All the way to 1948, the Zionists could never accept democracy, because democracy meant they would be in the minority. And so Zionists always supported anti-democracy. The way they justified it was nationalism, which was a fundamentally anti-democratic movement, which says the legitimacy of your claim to statehood is not based on the majority of the people that live in that state. What did they think? The Zionists rejected that view. That was the Palestinian view. The Zionists said the legitimacy of my claim to statehood is based on my claim to nationhood. And if I have a claim to nationhood, therefore I have a claim to statehood. And I think, whereas the Palestinians said, no, my claim to statehood is based on the democratic will of the people that live in this state. And I really think if you understand that, basically Zionists rejected democracy and Palestinians supported democracy. Again, like I said, in that early period, you wanted to bring this back to 1920. And so I think if you understand that principle, you understand really a key to understand the core reason why Palestinians feel, I think...
So this is even getting to, it wasn't even indigenous sentiment against settler colonialists. It was a democratic will of this multi-religious community, this multi-religious community that was saying, we're against these people who are not just not from here, but have an anti-democratic ideology that they want to push. We're against that because we're democratic. We're democratically minded. We don't want a, supremacist state. We want a multicultural state, right? Which, that's what we say in the West that we want. So we should be aligned with the Palestinians who were this way versus the Zionists who were this way. So again, I think that's a compelling argument.
why that they felt like Zionist immigration was illegal and fundamentally unethical.
Well,
Zach, real quick before you jump in.
Sure.
First of all, we just have a new paying member, so shout out to Sarah. Thank you for the support. And if anybody else wants to, you can click that join button
Go,
and
Sarah.
support, or find more info in the description. Real quick, Zach, before you answer, I just don't want us to get caught too much on history and what the land was prior to Jews arriving here. And the reason for this is, even if we could look back and see that things could have been done differently, and I certainly agree things could have been done differently, there really is no going back, right? We are where we are, and it's a question of moving forward. And many often look at like the relative peace we had amongst the different ethnic and religious groups living on the land, and that's a sign that we could just recreate that instantly. But the thing is, after 100 years of conflict,
Yeah, so I'm curious. So I did I pre-read the comments on the video, and one caught my eye that said, "Oh, something like the moderator is so biased," and I don't know if this is the moment that they were talking about that they wrote that comment, but the moderator has caught in and is now almost taking charge of Zach Corner's side of the argument. I'm curious to see if, in terms of how this will play out throughout the rest of the video, if this is going to be so I could see that in two ways. Either, oh, he's so biased, he wants this side to win, he doesn't think Zach Corner can do it, so he's going to cut in to try to fight for that side. Or you could see it as the moderator wants to give a kind of pushback, to have like a meaningful, interesting debate that he doesn't think Zach Corner will do. Yeah, I'm curious to see exactly what the structure of his kind of role as a moderator is going to be, because different people moderate very differently.
There is no going back, and we can't recreate the same system and world we were living in then. Certainly not overnight, within generations perhaps, but I just don't want us to get stuck in the fantasy of the past and get bogged down there. I'd rather us talk about the present and what we can do moving forward. So Zach, feel free to comment.
Yeah, just real quick, I agree that by a medieval standard, the Jews were treated well in pre-Ottoman Palestine, but that's not the standard that Israel is subjected to, and that's not the standard that we should subject that period to. Compared to a modern standard, modern America, let's say past the civil rights movement, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, France, Jews did not have equality with Palestinians. Now, were there moments, heartwarming moments of coexistence? I'm sure there were. I lived in Israel for 10 years. I could share many heartwarming moments. I remember being in the army with a Muslim soldier, and when the settlement found out that there was a Muslim soldier in our brigade, they immediately started inviting him every Friday night to turn on their lights and to turn on things that they forgot to turn on before Shabbat.
I mean, it's hard to ignore the irony. I thought he was going to talk about like that in the IDF he became friends with a Palestinian family or something, but he's saying there was they were really nice to this Muslim kid in the IDF, which is the army that's doing the occupying, and in the arguments that are going on are allegedly doing the genocide. So I didn't think that was going to be the anecdote he would turn to, but let's go ahead.
He became a Shabbos goy, and every week he came home with
he became a Shabbos goy. I don't know why he would say that from his side of the argument. Okay.
Big thing of food from the settlement because he was a non-Jew, and non-Jews were able to turn on the lights on Shabbat. I could tell you wonderful stories about Tel Aviv University with the coexistence between the mostly female Palestinian bodybuilders and lifters and the male trainers, and how wonderful the friendships were in the social circle. And I could tell you about
this guy is just like a weird example machine. Okay.
Mansour Abbas, who's a wonderful leader, who was part of the last government, who if I was in Israel, I would have happily voted for. And Zach, you would have dismissed this all as Hasbara and Zionist propaganda. It's not enough to compare your political community to the Germany of 1387. And it's not enough to come up with some stories of coexistence between peoples. In terms of the present, we have to ask, well, what sort of idea can we build a state on? What sort of idea can we base things on in order to have peace? And let me just...
Yeah, I mean, that was pretty argumentative rather than, again, kind of really, because, we all just heard what Zach Foster said. Wasn't saying, oh, this is, by medieval standard, this is good. He was saying this is a multicultural democracy. This is what everybody in the West is saying that we need everywhere. So it didn't really address that statement. He was saying, oh, maybe compared to medieval, whatever, but he didn't give an example of that. Um, yeah.
Just point out that that framework is an extremely Jewish way, and might I say a Zionist way, of looking at
Okay, I'm so curious where this is going.
the conflict. And I will just say that all three people here are Jewish, and that we have no Palestinian representation on this
Okay, where is he going with this?
platform. Because Palestinians, and I've heard, I mean, I could go through names, but I've heard them, both personal acquaintances.
Is I see lights flashing in front of in front of Adar. Is he looking for examples of like Palestinians he's had on his program?
And on Twitter and in their articles, they are not talking about peace. They are talking about justice. So the whole
Maybe, yeah, but that's okay. That might be true. That might not be damning though.
framework of how can we achieve peace is a very Jewish one. Whether you are on the right,
I mean, when it comes to like Israel is not primarily concerned with justice at this moment because what they don't have is peace, right? They're not asking for something from the Palestinians other than peace. The Palestinians are asking for justice from Israel. So it's not a Jewish versus non-Jewish thing. This is just what the peoples in these different circumstances are asking for or want or need.
or in the center, or on the left, or as my friend Zach is on the far left. That is a very, very Jewish way.
It's on the yeah, I don't know what he's trying to say by saying he's on the far left. Is he just trying to? I hope he's not just trying to say, "Oh, this guy's crazy. This guy's like extreme." Let's see him tie this together a little bit. Zach Corner.
Of looking at things. Now, on the question of right now, and what sort of idea can we build a state on, I agree that you cannot create true democracy on the idea of Jewish solidarity or on the idea of Jewish peoplehood. And there is no argument that I have heard that I found persuasive that convinces me that it's okay for Jews to have an ethnic state.
Okay, so again, I mean, it's weird. He's also really good at biting bullets and saying, yeah, if it were to be a Jewish ethno-state, that would be unjustified. I wouldn't support that. So he's also he kind of vacillates between, in my view, being extremely good faith and being not particularly bad faith, but not addressing kind of arguments so directly. It's interesting. It's an interesting mix.
And in fact, there are, I see some loyal listeners. You may recall that the last conversation we had, the fourth conversation, was not Zionist versus anti-Zionist, but was basically anti-Zionist talks to another anti-Zionist, because I see no moral justification for a Jewish state.
No moral justification for a Jewish state. You can have a Jewish state. That's okay. I mean, I'm. Okay.
Just like I don't see any moral justification for a Franco-Aryan state in France, or a Lutheran Aryan state in Germany, or a Scandinavian state in Sweden. That cannot serve as a basis for democracy. But neither can the idea that the Jews are settler colonials. There cannot be equality and peace. Or let's just start with equality. There cannot be equality between people who belong and people who don't belong. In order to have equality, there.
Yes. Okay. So, for this to connect to what Zach Foster was saying, Zach Corner would have to be replying, okay, those 1919, 1920s Palestinians who are a multicultural democracy, who are against the Zionists who are coming to a large degree because of their Zionist ideology, but that has to be welcome. This is where people generally invoke the paradox of tolerance, right? How can you be intolerant of our intolerance? Is kind of what he's saying, which, depending on where people fall on that, I think most people recognize that it's okay to not tolerate intolerance. That makes sense. What that means, where those lines fall, obviously is always debated. But I think a lot of people accept that principle that it's okay to not tolerate intolerance. That's not universal to be opposed to that.
Has to be this idea of belonging. That is the premise. That is the basis on which equality is built. And when you say that people who are descended from those who arrived after 1920 and the promulgation of the Balfour Declaration, when you say that, you know, the settler colonial status is inherited racially, that
I mean, he didn't say racially. That's not fair. But that's an interesting question of, okay, some people are coming who are settlers. That's one ding against them, but maybe not the main thing. And they have this ideology that is anti-democratic, and we're against that. That seems fair. But to say, oh, they're children, should they be, you know, shunned as well? I mean, if it's the case that they're children of the same ideology, then it seems like the same reasoning. You know, you wouldn't have the same kind of moral condemnation for somebody who was born in a circumstance than chose a circumstance, of course. But I'm not sure that this quite gets to the heart of some point. I see what he's saying, but it feels like this doesn't go all the way. Let's see if you can connect more and push it further.
settler colonial, my children will be a settler colonial, that Israelis going back 4 and 5 generations. There is no basis for democracy. And very often we hear this absurd comparison between the Palestinians and Martin Luther King and Black Americans.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I'm actually not quite sure where he's going with this.
And, you know, Nelson Mandela and Black South Africans.
Yeah, okay. I'm actually curious to see where it's going. Yeah, people do draw those comparisons. Yeah, I'm curious to see. Well, okay. I mean, there definitely are things that are not parallel, but I'm curious to see exactly what he's gonna pull out of there to focus on.
Mandela and Martin Luther King and the movements that they represented never claimed to be waging a campaign of decolonization. They were waging an anti-apartheid campaign.
This is interesting. Did Martin Luther King talk about decolonization? I mean, interesting. And Gandhi, I mean, it was anti-imperialism, and it was decolonization for Gandhi, for sure, right?